Section 8 of Crime, Its Causes and Remedies by Cesare Lombroso. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Leon Harvey. Chapter 8 Influence of Education upon Crime. Subchapter 49 Illiteracy and Crime. The absolute parallelism between education and crime, which many maintained several years ago, is today rightly regarded as an error. Barrow found that of 500 criminals and 500 honest men in Turin, there were illiterate, 12% criminal, 6% honest. Knowing how to read and write, 75% criminal, 67% honest. Educated, 12% criminal, 27% honest. With, it is true, a larger proportion of criminals among the illiterates, but also among those who could read and write. Morano proved in 1878 in Palermo that of 53 crimes committed in the school, 34 came from the pupils and 19 from the teachers, who certainly did not lack for education. Curcio found 1 convent in Italy to 284 of the illiterate population, and 1 to 292 of the educated, figures which, with a slight increase in illiterates among the criminals, would balance one another. These very slight differences become, in certain categories of crime, still less marked. 3/7 of the convicts had received elementary instruction, and 1/2 of those guilty of sexual offences, 1/2 for the minor offences, and 10/25 of the criminals against persons and property had received some instruction. Curcio, obsit. And while criminals in general give an average of from 50% to 75% of illiterates, criminals who are still minors average only 42%, and some provinces still lower. In Lombardy, for example, only 5% of the juvenile offenders are illiterate, and in Piedmont, 17%. As early as 1872, it had been estimated that to 453 illiterates there were 51 who could read, 368 who could read and write, 401 who could read, write and count, and 5 who had received a higher education. According to Joly, the Department of Heralds, which in 1866 gave the minimum of illiterates, 1% among the conscripts, at that time had the lowest place in the scale of criminality, whereas now that it has a great number of schools it is mounted to the highest, and a similar statement may be made of Doubs and Ron, obsit. On the other hand, Doubs Severes, Fridny, and Lot, with 12, Vienna with 14, Indra with 17, Gust du Nord with 24, and Morbihan with 35 illiterates finished the minimum degree of criminality, id. Levasseur calculates that of 100 persons inducted in France there were. A table is displayed on the page, with columns displaying the years between 1830 and 1878, and knowing how to read and write, and having high education. Thus in less than 30 years, criminals with more or less education doubled in number. Tocqueville shows that in Connecticut, criminality has increased with the increase in instruction. In the United States, the maximum figures for criminality is 0.35, 0.3, and 0.37 to the 1,000 were noted in Wyoming, California, and Nevada, which gave the minimum number of illiterates 3.4, 7.7, and 8%. And the minimum figures of criminality were found in New Mexico, 0.03, South Carolina, 0.06, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia, and Louisiana, which had the highest number of illiterates. Nebraska, Iowa, Maine, and Dakota were exceptional, having a small number of criminals and illiterates both, as a result of other causes which we shall see presently. In England, the counties of Surrey, Kent, Gloucester, and Middlesex, where there is a higher degree of education, gave the maximum degree of criminality, while the minimum was shown by the more illiterate districts, North Wales, Essex, and Cornwall. In Russia, where education is much less common, Oettingen, 3rd ed., page 587, calculates that 25% of the convicts know how to read and write, and even 29% of the men, while the population at large only 8% can read and write. Examine, says Loverage, the records of the courts, and you will see that the most unreformable criminals are all educated. Les Fourquets, page 207. But Coquelin gives us a still better proof in his Wealth of New South Wales, Sydney, 1895. There the percentage of illiteracy among the general population in 1880 was 12. The illiterate prisoners were 5.5% of the illiterate population, and the more or less educated prisoners 6.2% of the educated population. A table is displayed on the page, listing crimes against persons, against property of violence against property without violence, rioting, drunkenness, and counterfeiting, compared with persons arrested, illiterate, and knowing how to read and write. In 1891, the general percentage of illiteracy was 7%, the illiterates imprisoned 4.1%, and the educated persons imprisoned 4.7%. That is to say, absolutely as well as relatively, that persons who had received instruction had committed more crimes than the illiterate. A table is displayed on the page, listing Gloucester, Middlesex, North Wales, and Cornwall compared to convicts to 10,000 inhabitants, and percentage of illiterates. From 1891 to 1891, pupils in schools increased from 197,412 to 252,940, and the persons arrested from 39,758 to 44,851. For each 10 new schools opened, there were 5 more arrests, and this was true in all the different branches of crime. Subchapter 50. Diffusion of Education, Its Advantages. However, an impartial examination of the figures for these last years brings a comforting assurance that education is not so fatal as it appears at first to be. It favours crime only up to a certain point, after which its influence is the other way. Where education is widely diffused, the list of educated criminals increases, but the list of illiterate criminals increases still more, which shows that the criminality of the class with a moderate amount of education is decreasing. Thus in New York, while the whole population showed 6.08% of illiteracy, and the immigrants who furnished the greatest proportion of criminals only 1.83%, the criminal class showed an illiteracy of 31%. Of the homicides recently convicted in the United States, 33% were completely illiterate. 64% could read and write, and 3% had higher education, while the illiteracy of the population at large was only 10%. In Austria, while the young and moral population of Salzburg and the Tyrol have no illiterates, the criminal population show an illiteracy from 16% to 20%. Methodaclia. In the recent statistics of Joy, opposite, we find that in France, to the 100,000 inhabitants, 6 departments had 7 to 10 illiterates to 9 indictments. 13 departments had 10 to 20 illiterates to 9 indictments. 3 departments had 20 to 50 illiterates to 9 indictments. 11 departments had 50 to 61 illiterates to 9 indictments. Here crime increased with a moderate education and decreased with a higher education. In France also the following percentages of illiteracy were found. A table is displayed on the page, where the column listing the years of 1827 right to 1877 and compared among soldiers and among criminals. The illiterates in each of the two categories diminish each year. Then, but much more slowly among the criminals, and we may add that the criminal under 21 years of age decreased from 1828 to 1863 by 4,152 individuals. The facts appear still more clearly if we study the number of pupils in Europe following Levasseur, and the proportion of pupils in the public and private schools to the population following Baudieu, together with the statistics of homicides and thefts given by Ferry and those of revolutions given in my Crime Politique. We shall find the following data. A table is displayed on the page listing Prussia, Switzerland, England, Netherlands, Sweden, Austria, France, Belgium, Spain, Italy, and Russia, comparing data to pupils to 100 inhabitants, homicides 1880 to 82 to 100,000, thefts to 100,000, revolutions to 10 million. From this we see that the number of homicides decreases with the increase in the number of pupils, except in the case of Russia, with only 14 homicides notwithstanding the minimum number in the schools, 2.4, and of Switzerland, which has high figures for both pupils and homicides. Thefts follow the opposite course. They rise in England, Belgium, and Prussia, with a greater number of pupils in the schools, and fall in Spain with a smaller number. Revolutionary tendencies give contradictory results. This relation is maintained to a certain point everywhere if we study the nations severally. In Italy, the parallelism between homicide, rape, and ignorance is complete, the minimum, mean, and maximum of ignorance corresponding to those of the two crimes mentioned, as seen in the following table. A table is displayed on the page, number of crimes to the 100,000 inhabitants with illiteracy. The data compares homicides, rapes, frauds, and thefts to percentage illiterate. We have seen in France and England that crimes of blood are becoming more and more rare in the large cities, where they are nearly always committed by peasants and mountaineers. while crimes against property, on the other hand, are on the increase. A similar situation prevails in Italy with regard to recidivists, just because they are more educated. In Belgium, great crimes had decreased each year since 1832, falling from 1 to 83,573 of the population, which was a figure for the year mentioned, down to 1 for each 90,220 in 1855. In Switzerland, great crimes had decreased 40% since 1852. In France, the more serious crimes, those passed upon by the Assises, had fallen from 40 to 100,000, which was a figure in 1825, to 11 to the 100,000 in 1881, while the offences which came before the magistrates rose from 48,000 to 205,000. There is, it is true, an augmentation of crime amounting to 133%, but crimes of blood have diminished, while social crimes have been on the increase. From 1826 to 1880, thefts increased 238%, frauds 323%, breach of trust 630%, and sexual crimes 700%. Vagrancy is 4 times greater, and offences against officials 5 times. Bankruptcies have risen from 2,000 to 8,000, and while the number of merchants has increased, of course, this increase has not been in the same proportion. These differences express the influence of education, but this influence has been more remarkable as well as more favourable in England, where from 1868 to 1892 the number of prisoners fell from 87,000 to 50,000, and the number of adult criminals from 31,295 to 29,825. Yet the population increased in the same time 12%, and now it is calculated that there are about 21 illiterates out of every 100 indicted. This diminution occurs especially in London, where schools are more numerous and widely diffused. Subchapter 51. Special criminality of the illiterate and of the educated. All this explains a phenomenon which appears at first completely self-contradictory, namely, that education now increases crime and now decreases it. When education is not yet diffused in a country and has not yet reached its full development, it at first increases all crime except homicide. But when it is widely disseminated, it diminishes all the violent crimes except, as we shall see, the less serious crimes, the political crimes, or the commercial or sexual crimes, because these increase naturally with the increase of human intercourse, business, and cerebral activity. But education has an indisputable influence upon crime in changing its character and making it less savage. Fayette and Lacazette show that in France, 1. Among illiterates, the crimes which lead are infanticide, abortion, theft, formation of criminal bands, robbery, and arson. 2. Among those who can read and write imperfectly, extortion, threatening letters, blackmail, robbery, injury to property, and assaults predominate. 3. Among those who have received a moderate education, bribery, forgery, and threatening letters prevail. 4. Among the well-educated, the predominant crimes are forgeries of commercial papers, official crimes, forgery, abstraction of public documents, and political crimes, obscene. The minimum of forgeries and the maximum of infanticides are found among the illiterate. With the convicts of a higher education, the prevailing crime is forgery of public documents, breach of trust, and swindling. Infanticides and violent crimes are lacking. Accordingly, there is a type of crime for the illiterate, namely the savage type, and one for the educated, the milder but more cunning type. In the same way, according to the most recent studies of Soquet, we see that in France the illiterate criminals gradually diminished in the period 1876 to 80, in comparison with the period 1831 to 35. Homicides and murders have decreased among them by half, infanticides and abortions by a third, and sexual crimes nearly a half. The violent crimes of educated criminals are, on the whole, diminishing, while their other crimes are nearly at a standstill. As to political crimes, these increase constantly among the educated. History teaches us that it has been the highly civilized states, Athens, Genoa, Florence, which furnish the maximum number of revolutions, and it is certainly not among the illiterate that the nihilists and anarchists get their recruits, but among the more highly educated. Of this I have given abundant proof in my Crime Politique. In Austria, the crimes which prevail among the illiterate are robberies, abductions, infanticides, abortions, murders, bigamy, homicides, malicious injury to property, and assaults. In Italy, following the remarkable study of Amati, we find a table displayed on the page with 4 columns. Listed as crimes 1881-83, with political crimes, frauds, homicides, thefts, rapes, rebellions, compared to illiterate percentages, able to read and write in percentages, and more highly educated percentages. Among 500 individuals who had a higher education, there were in 1881-83 the following number of the crimes specified, the second figure giving the number to the 1000. Forgeries 76 to 152, homicides 44-88, thefts 40-80, frauds 57-114, extortions 38-76, highway robberies 22-44, sexual crimes 34-68, bankruptcies 33-66, perjuries 2-4, assaults 13-26, parricides 2-4, political crimes 14-28, crimes against religion 1-2, destruction of property 4-8, arson 9-18, instigation of crime 6-12, abortions 1-2. That is to say, the figures are higher for forgery, fraud, sexual crime, bankruptcy, theft, extortion, and homicide, and lower for assault, highway robbery, parricide, and arson. Accordingly, while the illiterate lead in homicide and theft, the fully and partially educated together show a higher figure for political crimes and an absolute majority of the rapes and frauds. But it should be observed here that the above statistics belong to a period when thought was completely free in Italy, and when, therefore, though comparatively few political uprisings did not draw into their ranks the better part of the population, hence the relatively large number of illiterates. Now, however, those condemned for political crimes belong to the more highly educated strata of the nation. The same thing is true of Russia, where the greatest number of political offenders is furnished by the educated class. Thus, from 1827 to 1846, the nobles exiled to Siberia for political causes were 120 times as numerous as the peasants. Of 100 women condemned for political crimes in Russia, 75 were well educated, 12 could read and write, and 7 were illiterate. It cannot be said, then, that education always acts as a preventive of crime, nor on the other hand that it always impels toward crime. When it is really diffused among all classes, it has a beneficial effect, diminishing the number of crimes among the moderately educated and making the character of them milder. Subchapter 52. Education in the Prisons. However, if education is valuable for the population in general, it nevertheless ought not to be extended to the inmates of prisons, unless it is accompanied by a special training designed to correct the passions and instincts rather than to develop the intellect. Elementary education is positively harmful as applied to the ordinary criminal. It places in his hands an additional weapon for carrying on his crimes, and makes a recidivist of him. The introduction of schools into the prisons, at once bringing bad men into contact with each other and developing their intelligence and power, explains, to my mind, the great number of educated recidivists. For statistics show us that of crimes against property made easier by education, recidivists committed over twice as many, 67.4%, as non-recidivists, 28.47%, although crimes against persons were relatively much fewer. It is doubtless the elementary instruction given in the prisons of France, Saxony, and Sweden that accounts for the large number of forgeries committed by recidivists. The pickpocket and cutthroat learn in prison at the expense of the state and make false keys, to make counterfeit money, to engrave banknotes, and to commit burglaries. Subchapter 53. Dangers of Education. Knowledge, says Seymour, is power, not virtue. It may be the servant of good, but it may also be the servant of evil. To put the same truth in other words, the simple sensory knowledge, or the form of letters, or the sound which indicates an object, or the knowledge even of the great technical scientific advances which have been made, does not raise a moral plane in the least degree. Indeed, it may become, on the contrary, a powerful instrument for evil, by creating new crimes that more easily escape the clutches of the law. Thus, the advancement of science may enable criminals to use a railroad, as was the case with Taybird in 1845, or dynamite, as with Thomas, or the telegraph and cipher messages, as in the case of the Venetian Fangin, who used this means to indicate to his accomplices the courier who was to be robbed. Caruso, the bandit, who were accustomed to say that if he had known the alphabet he would have conquered the world, and the murderer Del Perro declared, at the foot of the gallows, and the cause of his ruin was the education which his parents had procured for him, since it had made him prefer idleness and poorly paid labour. Finally, all criminals learn, by reading the accounts of trials, of which they are very fond, to put into practice the arts of their predecessors. Thus, among 150 vagrants, may you found 50 who had read Jack Sheppard and other stories of criminals, who declared that this reading had inspired their first steps in a life of crime. From the lowest education to the highest among the Latins, with whom crime is continually increasing, there is no teaching given that does not open the wound rather than heal it. And especially is this the case with political crimes. We live in a stirring time when the days are years and the years centuries, and would have our young people live in an atmosphere thousands of years old. The best intelligence has not time enough to take in that part of knowledge that is necessary to all, like natural history, hygiene, modern languages and economics, and would have the youth spend his precious hours in learning to babble dead languages and dead sciences, and all is to make him a man of good taste. It seems ridiculous to waste 10 or 12 years on flowers and musical scales. The mighty torrent of modern life, laden with facts, passes before us and we do not see it. How it will make our descendants smile to think that thousands and thousands of men have seriously believed that some reluctantly learned and quickly forgotten fragment of the classics, or worse still, the dry rules of ancient grammar, were the best means of developing the mind and forming the character of a young man. Better means than the exposition of the most important facts, better means than study of the causes of those facts. In the meanwhile, we are creating generation after generation whose brains are crammed with study of the form only and not of the substance, and worse than this, since the form may be transmitted in some masterpiece, with an adoration of the form which amounts to fetishism, and is the more false, blind, and sterile the longer it has been profitlessly employed. It is from this sort of education that has come the adoration of violence, and has been the starting point of all our rebels, from Cola di Renzi to Robespierre. What is the whole classical education but a continual glorification of violence in all its forms? In this matter all political parties are alike, so deep-seated is evil. The clericals cry hurrah at the danger thrust of Ravaillac, and the conservatives do likewise at the wholesale execution of the communists in 1871. What wonder then that in a society saturated with violence breaks out from time to time on all sides in storm and lightning. It is not possible to declare with impunity that violence is holy, with a proviso that is to be used only in a certain way, for sooner or later someone will come to transfer the gospel of force from one political creed to another. I am glad that my illustrious master Taine has preceded me in this line of thought. In his last pages he has given an almost posthumous admonition to us poor Latins, so vainglorious and so obstinately attached to that which is our ruin. The true learning, the true education, writes Taine, is acquired by contact with things, by innumerable sense impressions which a man receives all day in the laboratory, the workshop, the courtroom, or the hospital, impressions which enter by the ears, the eyes, the nose, to be consciously or unconsciously assimilated by him, and which sooner or later suggest to him a new combination, a simplification, an economy, an improvement, an invention. Of these invaluable contacts, of all these assimilable and indispensable elements of mental life, the French youth is deprived just at the most fruitful age. For 7 or 8 years he is sharp in school, cut off from the personal experience that would give him a correct and vivid idea of things, of men, and of the way to equip himself for life. It is too much to demand of young people that upon a set day they shall present themselves in the examination room in the possession of all knowledge. As a matter of fact, after 2 months after the examination they have forgotten everything. For the meantime their mental vigour declines, freshness and fertility disappear. The accomplished man, or rather the man who is no longer capable of any change, becomes degenerate, resigned to a life of routine, perpetually turning the same wheel. On the other hand, the Anglo-Saxons, the only race in Europe, as we shall see, among whom criminality is declining, have not our innumerable special schools. Among them instruction is given not by the book, but through the object itself. The engineer, for example, is educated not in the school, but in the workshop, a thing which permits each man to reach the grade suited to his intelligence. Workman or builder, if he can raise no higher; engineer, if his talents permits. With us, on the other hand, with the 3 grades of instruction, for childhood, youth, and young manhood, with the theoretic and scholastic instruction imparted by means of benches and books. The mental tension is simply increased and prolonged by the prospect of examinations, diplomas, degrees, and commissions, while our schools do not give the indispensable equipment, namely, a sound and firm understanding, will, and nerves. So the entrance of the student to the world and his first steps in the field of practical action are oftenest but a succession of unfortunate falls, from which he emerges bruised, even if not crippled. It is a rough and dangerous experiment. His mental poise is disturbed, and he is in danger of not being re-established. The disillusioning is too rude and too violent. Finally, education often incites to evil by creating new needs and aspirations without giving the power to gratify them. Especially this brought about by the mingling of good and bad elements in the school, and influence the more dangerous when the teacher himself inclines to evil, particularly as sexual relations, as has been observed in Italy and Germany. In this matter I am much of Dante's opinion. Certo l'argumento de la mente, se aguinge, alba voler et alla posa, nessun reparo a vir pua far la gente. He reckons, as jolly, upon the schools supplying the place of the parents, who are kept occupied at their work, or who lack the knowledge or ability to do their duty by their children. And you count, on the other hand, on the family to supply the deficiency of the moral training of the school. But while each waits for the other, they unite in accomplishing nothing. There is a footnote of the page, translated from the Italian prose, where intelligence is united with power and wickedness, the efforts of men are vain. Inferno, Chapter 31. End of Section 8.